Hey y'all, it's Misty Williams from Healing Rosie, and very excited to have this awesome conversation with Inna today about her upcoming event, the Overcoming Hashimoto's Summit. And I want to just kind of create a frame here for this conversation because we talk a lot about Hashimoto's in the Healing Rosie Facebook group, and there's a lot of women that have thyroid issues. And then there's women in our community and in our group that have autoimmune issues that maybe don't manifest as Hashimoto's, but maybe they have something else going on. They've got endometriosis, they've got polycystic ovarian syndrome, they've got fibromyalgia or rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or any number of other autoimmune issues. There's also women who are just dealing with skin issues that they know are not normal, and like, what is happening to my body? And they're having digestive issues. And sometimes, we've got stuff going on that hasn't been fully diagnosed as autoimmune, but it has the semblance. We know it's kind of looking like what we see with autoimmune issues. And I want to talk today not only about the event that she's doing, but I want to peel back some layers here on this autoimmune conversation, because what's really important to me as a woman on this journey is that I have some insight into what I need to be looking for, and I get some really practical tools for navigating. And I know that that's what Inna has been committed to in putting together this summit. She has some amazing doctors, practitioners, experts in our space that are coming together to support us. And we're going to talk all about it during this interview. So welcome, Inna.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited that you're here too. And your summit is coming up. I think by the time that we air this particular interview, we're going to probably be about 6 weeks out from the launch of your summit. So we're going to actually be spending the next 6 weeks with you, learning a lot of the things that people are going to learn in the summit and doing everything we can to get our community really involved, because if there's anything that I can do to help lift the boats and equip people, I feel like it's my mission. So I know that you really share that. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about your own story, your journey with all of this stuff? And you have this diagnosis of Hashimoto's, and it seems to have informed this whole path for you, just like Healing Rosie has been informed by my own journey. So tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I was never a super healthy child. So I was someone who was kind of always sickly. I would get colds a lot and flus and sore throats. And I remember my mom used to chase after me with shots of penicillin. I grew up in Lithuania, and that's what they did. You were
Yeah.
sick, you get penicillin. And, as I got older, I'd get colds a lot. I was tired a lot. And, I went through high school and college and felt okay, but I didn't feel amazing. And again, just got sick a lot. And then after I graduated college and started a full-time job, I was working on Wall Street in New York City. I mean, I should be having the time of my life, but instead I was so tired. I also had a lot of acne. I had a lot of digestive issues. I had headaches. I had really bad PMS symptoms, and I just did not feel well. And so that's when I started my journey to try to find answers. And back then, we're going back to around 2001, functional medicine, of course, was around, but it wasn't as popular as it is now. And so I went to the conventional route. I saw regular doctors, and they said, "Oh, we're not sure what's wrong with you. Here's some medication." Then I went to different specialists, and I got what I call that disjointed care, which unfortunately so many people get. What happened was I saw a neurologist for my headaches, and they said, "Well, you should exercise more. That'll help the headaches." Meanwhile, I was really tired. I couldn't exercise. I saw a gastroenterologist who told me I had IBS. They tried to give me medicine, which made other things worse. I saw a dermatologist for my skin who gave me antibiotics. Then that gave me a yeast infection. I had to go see a gynecologist. So it was like this round and round. I think it's probably pretty familiar, unfortunately, to people in your community, because that happens. And then finally, I saw an endocrinologist, and they told me, "You know what? You have Hashimoto's." I was so excited. And I know people might look at this and think, "Well, that's weird. Why are you excited to have something?" But I finally had an answer. It was like, wait a minute, there's really a reason to all of this. But what happened next, unfortunately, was a little bit defeating, because she said to me, "Well, there's no cure, so we're just going to wait and see." And I said to her, "Well, what do you mean we're going to wait and see?" And she's like, "Well, eventually the Hashimoto's will destroy your thyroid, at which point I'm going to give you medicine, and then you'll have to likely be on it forever." And, I didn't have much of a clinical or medical background at that time, But I knew deep down that
Yeah.
that just wasn't, it just didn't seem right to me. And that's really what started my journey. I mean, even though my health journey started before that, this is really what made me realize something's got to change here. And that's when I found functional medicine. And again, I mean, there was not much social media then. It wasn't as easy as it is now. So I feel very lucky to have found a naturopathic doctor that was able to kind of explain everything to me. And then step by step, one thing by, another, we started to work on stuff. And I had a lot of things, a lot of the sort of triggers, which I know we're going to go into more today. I had heavy metals. I had 16 amalgam fillings that needed to be taken care of. I had copper toxicity. I had a lot of parasites and really bad candida. And I still had really bad acne too, which wasn't so much of a Hashimoto sort of symptom. But I think, as a woman in her 20s, what you look like is important. And so the sort of, I don't even want to say vanity. I don't know if I'd call it that, but just the part of me that really wanted to look confident and feel confident. I just felt like I wanted to hide my skin a lot. And I knew that, and I've been on so many antibiotics, so many medicines for that. I knew that there was an underlying reason for that too. And really it was a combination of all of these triggers that was the answer for me. It wasn't just one thing, it was all of that. And I just had to figure out what they were for me.
Yeah. So this is something that I really want to highlight in the conversation that we're having today is in my own journey. When I was initially diagnosed with endometriosis, I, of course, heard something similar. My doctor told me they didn't know what caused it. I could Google it. And her solution was to wait and see. And if it came back, she'd do surgery. So this is totally not an uncommon story. And I know many women in my community are experiencing similar things with their doctors who just don't want to look at or acknowledge the fact that something is off and wrong. And one of the things that I found really empowering that actually only happened for me in the last few years was understanding this idea of triggers and stressors. Because it's one thing to get a diagnosis of something. It's another thing to, like, as Dr. Dan Pompa would say, go upstream or look at the root cause of, like, why is this happening, and fix the thing that's triggering the dysfunction in the first place. And I know this has been something that you set an intention on really addressing in this summit, not just kind of talking about Hashimoto's and, getting really deep into the science of why it exists and, practical tools just for Hashimoto's, but you're kind of taking this broader look at why is autoimmune disease happening and what are the triggers for autoimmune disease. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about that?
Of course. Yeah. And I think with Hashimoto's, to your point, is that a lot of people think of it as, okay, it affects the thyroid. And yes, Hashimoto's will eventually attack the thyroid. Well, it's attacking the thyroid. Eventually it will weaken the thyroid. But, there's so much of a connection. Oh, Hashimoto's thyroid. Everyone just kind of goes like this. But Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease. And so that's what I really want everyone to understand, and not to scare anyone in any way, but just to understand that it's not the thyroid's fault. Your thyroid is just an innocent bystander that the immune system got confused and just happened to attack the thyroid. And we know research shows that when you have one autoimmune, you are more likely to get others in your lifetime. They say you can have up to 8 different autoimmune diseases if you have one. And the reason for that is that if the immune system is confused for whatever reason, which we'll talk about in a second, and it attacks one organ, what's to say that it's not going to start attacking another and another and another? And it does. And so when we look at these, what we call triggers, they're basically things that got the immune system confused in the first place. And so what often happens is, if you think about your immune system, it is supposed to know what's good and be gentle to it. And then what's bad, things like viruses and bacteria and other environmental toxins perhaps, and know that those are bad and attack them. But imagine that you have a lot of infections. And when I talk about infections, I'm not necessarily saying that, you're very, very sick, but something, let's say, like candida, which is a yeast, and we can have that overgrowing in our intestines. Or maybe we have a parasite, not something that will make you malnourished and, have diarrhea all the time, but there's so many parasites like blastocystis or cryptosporidium that, maybe cause some IBS symptoms, but a lot of conventional doctors don't really kind of look at them as, quote unquote pathogenic. So they'll just say, oh, it's fine, and they don't even address it. A lot of times they don't even test for it. So when you have these infections, they become more chronic, the immune system is going to try to attack it. But if they're pretty widespread, it can't really fight them. So it's kind of like going, but it can't really get rid of them. And eventually it gets tired. And so the analogy that I use for that, it's sort of like, if we have a war going on, right, we have soldiers that go to war, and sometimes wars go on for a long time. And unfortunately, sometimes they come back wounded, sometimes they come back with PTSD, and, they need to be treated and they need help. And so it's the same thing with the immune system. It kind of goes to war, and sometimes it comes back with PTSD and has, this confusion that, so all of these chronic infections that we have can attack it. So that's one big trigger. Toxins are another big trigger. And when we talk about toxins, it's a lot of different things. So heavy metals are huge, and especially for Hashimoto's and, other autoimmune diseases, it plays a role. So things like mercury, copper, arsenic, lead, and these are things that we can get exposed to pretty easily. And I think a lot of people probably know about the mercury in fish and amalgam fillings, but it's also in the environment. It's in the water. There's a lot of ways we can get exposed, even if we live sort of a healthy life. And how our liver and our intestines and our gallbladder does detoxification also really affects stuff. So two people, you and I can eat the same amount of fish. We can be living together eating the same thing, but I may accumulate more mercury than you just because of some of my genetic predispositions or the way my body is working and so on. But then we also have things like PCBs and halogens and, other personal care products like parabens that, all count as toxins. So these are all things that our body has to process, and it's sort of that overflowing bucket. When you have a bucket and there's not any more room for anything to go in, sometimes people say, oh, I was feeling fine, and then, I went out and I had a little too much to drink, and then I started not to feel well after that. And I often say to that, it's not the couple of glasses of wine that you had, probably. It's more that your bucket was full. The wine was just that straw that broke the camel's back. And then that's when things are starting to happen because the bucket is overflowing. So, the goal there is to kind of look and see what's in our bucket. How can we take stuff out? And with these triggers, we have the infections and the toxins, which already I know is a lot of stuff. But what I want people to know is it's not about kind of feeling overwhelmed about all the potential triggers that you have. It's more just knowing that these triggers are out there, and you're not going to have every single one of them. But I'd rather people know about all of the triggers that are there so they can look and see which ones are theirs, and then to know that there is an answer. On top of that, also, if we think about this bucket, it's not about getting it down to zero because, we've lived our lives and we've had certain things that we've been exposed to. We may not be able to get everything out of the bucket. That's okay. If we get our threshold down, so let's say if we're overflowing now, if we take half the stuff out, now we have more room in the bucket. So when things come in and we have stressors and other things like that, it's going to be okay. So it's just about kind of going through the big ones. Yeah. And then, in addition to infections and toxins, we also have stress from, both physical and also emotional stress, which, we could do a whole other show on that. We know how much that affects us. And then foods are big triggers. And, I think a lot of people with autoimmunity know that gluten and dairy can play a role, but it really can be anything, and everyone is different. So whenever you're eating a food and your body doesn't like it, it can create that attack.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Hashimoto's, because I think the general conception around Hashimoto's is that it's a disease which affects your thyroid, and now you're going to have issues, with your thyroid, and some of the hypothyroid symptoms commonly are, paired with a Hashimoto's diagnosis. But you are in your summit, you talk about the fact that a Hashimoto's diagnosis and the way that it affects your life can often extend beyond the thyroid. Why don't you unpack that for us?
Absolutely. And so for some people, their thyroid may not even be affected, but other organs can be affected because it just creates a lot of inflammation. And then oftentimes with Hashimoto's, the TSH, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone, can fluctuate. And that's because there may be a lot of inflammation, a lot of attack on some days and less attack of other days. And your thyroid actually holds and stores some of the hormone that you make. So if there's a lot of attack, the hormone spills out into your bloodstream. And so people can often have these back and forth symptoms that don't really always kind of feel like thyroid symptoms. So they could be tired one day, and then another time they could be feeling like they're sweating and they have oily skin and hair that's more oily and feel anxious. And these aren't symptoms that you're really associating always with hypothyroidism, which is more, fatigue, weight gain, PMS, and things like that. But also, when you have a lot of inflammation, it is going to affect how everything else processes. So your digestion, for example, it's possible if your thyroid is slower that you may be more prone to constipation, right? And that potentially could start it. But what we know is elimination is very, very important for everything in the body. So, you think about leaving garbage out on a 90-degree day, not so good. So the same thing if we're not eliminating. And what can come from that is if we're not eliminating and everything slows down, first of all, that can create more SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIFO, small intestine fungal overgrowth, which can create a lot of gas and bloating and distension. On top of that, when we look at hormone balance, and there's such a connection between what's happening with autoimmunity, thyroid, and hormones, is if everything is in balance, right, we should be producing a certain amount of estrogen and progesterone. But there's a term that we hear often called estrogen dominance, and that's when people have too much estrogen. And that can cause a lot of different symptoms, and some of which can actually be similar to thyroid symptoms. So inability to lose weight, and skin issues, and PMS issues, fatigue as well, and mood problems. So with that, what people don't often realize is that we may be producing a normal amount of estrogen. It's not necessarily that we're overproducing it. However, we have to metabolize that estrogen and we have to excrete it. So if our thyroid slow down, we have constipation, we have SIBO, we have other overgrowth. Now the whole thing is slowed down, and then there's an enzyme in our gut called the beta-glucuronidase enzyme, which can get affected by all this. And what it does is it actually unbinds the estrogen that your body's trying to get out. So we can create estrogen dominance in our body kind of unknowingly from that. And you don't always think about Hashimoto's estrogen dominance, but that's how it can kind of come full circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Why don't you, for those that don't really understand what estrogen dominance is, why don't you explain that?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. So estrogen dominance is when there's more estrogen than progesterone at a given time. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your estrogen is going to be too high. I see a lot of people where on their blood work, their estrogen may be within the normal range or maybe even a little bit lower than normal. But then if you look at their progesterone, it's a lot lower. So it's just the balance of estrogen and progesterone, and there's more estrogen than progesterone, which is really something that we want to be mindful of because your body needs to have that balance, and a lot of symptoms can come from having too much estrogen.
So I've heard talk in our community of the estrogen progesterone ratio. Some recommend, I think it's 300-1 is a good estrogen progesterone ratio. Others in the community completely poo-poo it like it's just absurd to think that there's some kind of ratio. What say ye?
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, I think that it depends on how you're testing. So the ratio is going to be much different if you're testing blood versus if you're testing saliva versus if you're testing urine. And of course, it also changes if someone's on bioidentical hormones or doing supplements or any kind of support. So I kind of tend to individualize it a little bit more. And not to say that the ratio is not important. I just think depending on the person and where they are, that tends to change. The other thing that's also important to remember is the tests need to be taken on day 21 or, about 7 days after ovulation, depending, of course, on the length of your cycle. It could be between, day 19 or 23-ish. Because sometimes what happens is people don't take it on that day. They see low progesterone and normal or high estrogen, think, oh no, I have estrogen dominance. But if you're on day 9 of your cycle, you really shouldn't have much progesterone. So a ratio done on that day is going to be very different than done on day 21, 22.
Mm-hmm. So this is
but it kind of depends on the person. Yeah.
This is one of those things where you, from your perspective, you really think someone should be working with a good practitioner to really analyze what's happening with their hormones?
Yeah. But there's also symptoms that they can look at. So for example, if you have PMS, if you have bloating a week before your period, if you get tender swollen breasts about a week or a couple of days before your period. Another thing that we see with estrogen dominance is not sweating enough. And so I know that this is something that people usually think is a good thing. I was like, oh, I don't sweat at all. Look, I can wear the shirts. And but if you go to the gym and you have a pretty good workout and everyone's dripping in sweat and you maybe have just like a little bit, that's actually a sign there could be estrogen dominance. And then skin, with estrogen dominance, there can be some eczema and other things, but in terms of breakouts, typically with estrogen dominance, skin's going to be clearer with less breakouts. So if you have and of course, one of those symptoms isn't going to count because that could be anything. But if you have 3 or 4 or more of those symptoms, that's an indication that can be an issue.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about lab work. One of the things that I found super empowering in my journey was learning what labs to run, so that I could kind of look at some data for myself and make some decisions on where I sought care, independent from practitioners and doctors I was working with who didn't seem to want to acknowledge anything I was experiencing. So that's a big deal in our community. You know, as you know, I have this lab tracker for everyone in our community to download that lets them know the functional lab ranges for some of the most common optimizing labs that we can use to really get a picture of what's going on in our body. So I'd like for you just to share a little bit around lab work and thyroid, because so many women in the community are dealing with thyroid issues. The lab tracker has some of the basics for testing thyroid. I think we've got in there some of the iron labs, selenium, zinc, I'm sure, and then of course the basic thyroid labs. But there's some other ways that you can look at your lab work to see how your thyroid has been affected by something like Hashimoto's. So why don't you unpack that for us a bit?
Of course. So in terms of blood work, we want to make sure that we're looking to see how much your thyroid is first impacted by the Hashimoto's. And if you're on medicine or even natural medicine or supplement support, that your thyroid is supported. So, you know, with some of the basics, we want to look at TSH, total T4, total T3, free T4, free T3, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies. And ideally, thyroid antibodies should be undetectable. And for thyroid antibodies, we're talking about the thyroid peroxidase and the antithyroglobulin antibody. So they should be under whatever the lab's range is. Now, depending on who you speak to, some practitioners would say they want them at 0 or under 5, because some ranges will be, 0 to 34. So if someone's at 33, yeah, you're within the range, but it's more than 0. For me, I like for them to be undetectable, but I think it also depends on the person. And I think it's because personally, my antibodies have been very high. They've been over 6,000 at one point, and have fluctuated in the past. And so I think I naturally attract people that also have high antibodies. So if I see at 33, I'm not saying that I don't pay attention. Of course, it's important, but most people that I see are, 600, 700, 1,000. But still, if you're on the high end of that lab sort of normal range, that's an indication that there is some attack that's going on. So we want to evaluate that. And I know you guys have all of those functional ranges for that. Do you want me to go through those, or do you have that for everyone?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, the way that I look at it is for TSH, because it's thyroid stimulating hormone. It's not actually a thyroid hormone. It's a pituitary hormone. And so I like to see it ideally between about 1.8 and 3. And again, it does depend on the person, and some people, there might be some fluctuations, but ideally I want to see it there. And sometimes people ask, well, don't you want my TSH as low as possible? Because there are some doctors that believe that. But we don't want that, because if your TSH is too low, that's actually an indication that the pituitary is not stimulating the thyroid properly. And especially if you have a low TSH and a low T4, that's telling me that something could be going on with the pituitary, and there's usually an adrenal issue that goes along with that as well. So you want the TSH in that sort of middle range of 1.8 to 3. For T4 total, I like it between about 6 and 12. And if I see a T4 under 6, it's an indication with a low TSH that it's a pituitary issue. For free T4, I'd like to see between about 1 and 1.5. And then for T3 total, I like to see that between 100 and 150. Sometimes labs write it as 1.0 to 1.5. It's the same thing, just moving the decimal. And then ideally free T3 between 3 and 4, and a reverse T3 under about 14, 15. Now, with that, what I find often, and I bet that you probably have people in your community that are finding as well, even functional medicine practitioners who, understand this, but sometimes I don't know if it's because they're trying to maybe save money on lab work, or maybe it's just hard to do everything each time. What they'll do is they'll run a TSH, a free T4, and a free T3, and will not run the totals. And, a lot of people believe that the frees are the ones that are going to your cells, and they're the most important. And I'm not disagreeing, they are important. But what sometimes can happen is if you don't do the totals, and if your T3 free and T4 free is normal or even high normal, if you have a lot of inflammation in the body, it could be because it's not getting into the cell. And so the way to really know that is that if we have a total T3 and total T4 that are on the lower end, so let's just say, ideal for T3, right, is 100 to 150. Ideal for T4 is 6 to 12. So let's say someone has like a 5 for total T4. And let's say they have like a 65 or 70 for total T3. And then we run their freeze, and their free T3 might be 3.5 and the free T4 might be like a 1.4. When you see them together, wait a minute, something is happening here, because you can't have such high freeze with such low totals. That's telling me it's not getting into the cell. Something is happening. But if you don't run those totals and just look at the freeze, you might say, wow, your thyroid's amazing. Everything is working well. And so a lot of people can get missed that way.
Yeah. This is the kind of stuff that I see talked about over at Stop the Thyroid Madness and in some other communities like that, where, you might have a good free T3 number, but there's so many other things that are really important to look at if you have the hypothyroid symptoms in particular, or even the hyper symptoms. Having that free T3 number it's a starting point, but if you don't have some of these other markers to make sense of what that number means, you can be a little debilitated in actually how to treat, because you're making some assumptions that aren't based on enough data, basically.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And then of course, reverse T3 is very important, because if that's elevated, even if you have amazing total T3 and free T3, when you have high reverse, it blocks your body from really using that T3. So anything above 15, and it depends. I mean, there's ratios we can look at, but, if it's, 16, but your total T3 and free T3 are okay, that's usually okay. But if it's a 25 and your T3s are normal or low normal, then we know we have an issue.
Yeah. So what would make the body produce a lot of reverse T3?
Typically stressors and inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's kind of a big general thing, but it could be a lot of things within that. So stressors can be emotional stress, obviously whatever people are dealing with at home, at work, family, but it also can be physical stressors. So if you have an infection and you're not treating it properly or not addressing it, or if there's a toxin that's trying to get out and your body can't get it out, that's going to be seen as stress. Another big thing that I think it's simple, but people forget, and it's blood sugar dysregulation. I think that so often people are focused on what to eat, right? So we're not going to eat gluten, which is very common with Hashimoto's and autoimmunity. We're not going to eat dairy. We're going to not eat this, this, and this. But then, we find all of these kind of handy substitutes, right? There's gluten-free products, and there's even grain-free sort of snacks out there. And not to say that they're all bad. I think, there's a time and place. But, I think people focus so much on what they're eating that they're not focusing on how they're combining those foods and how they're timing everything. And if our blood sugar isn't balanced, that's one of the biggest physical stressors on the body. And people forget that all the time.
Yeah. The reason why I wanted you to talk about this is that a lot of times when we see reverse T3, we clinically have learned from hearing a lot of talks, that if you're hypo and you have a reverse T3 issue, that what you need to do is focus more on maybe like a Cytomel or a T3 only. What I really want to point out and emphasize here is that if you have a high reverse T3, something else is going on in the body. It's not enough for you just to say, I'm going to go take Cytomel, change my meds up. If your reverse T3 is high, you've got some stressors, some inflammation, something deeper that you need to address. And when we talk about wanting to get after the root cause and not only treat our symptoms, and that's what we, make a stand for really when we join a community like Healing Rosie, we're wanting to go deeper. That's a really important tell if you have a high reverse T3 number.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, that Cytomel works for some people and not for others. And I think it's to exactly your point that it may not work because you're not addressing the actual root cause.
Yeah. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about some of your favorite options to support the thyroid, both naturally and using prescriptions?
Sure. So this is going to be very, very individual. And sometimes it's trial and error based on, how people feel. But what I try to do, and, I want to just preface this by saying I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't prescribe medication. I only do supplements, but I work with a lot of doctors, both in my area and in the areas of where my clients are, and kind of advise, and we sort of work together on what the best protocol is. So let's see, there's so much there. Well, first, I think that depending on how high or low the hormones are is how we first decide if we need medication or not. I am of the thought that if thyroid hormones are still within range, but maybe just a little bit on the lower end, we can start by supporting it naturally. However, if they're actually already out of range, and especially if they're out of lab range and TSH is off, then, and this again is my opinion, people have, of course, different opinions, I think that medication is necessary. And I have a personal experience with this because studying clinical nutrition and going through all the schooling and everything else that I did, my TSH has always been a little off and my hormones were always a little low. But I was very adamant about treating it naturally because I felt like this is what I do and I'm not going to get a medication because I'm only doing stuff naturally. But what happened was after a while, and it helped a little, but my levels were really off. I had Hashimoto's for a long time, before I even checked my thyroid levels. And I unfortunately was doing myself a disservice because not only did I not feel good because we need thyroid hormone for every single cell in our body. If we don't have that, not only is that going to affect how you feel, but it affects everything in your body. You need it for digestion. You need it for obviously our skin, our hair, our energy, all of our other organs. So, we want to be careful about, and again, natural is good, but we don't want to kind of go overboard and then hurt our body in the process.
Yeah, so, I want to say something along these lines. First of all, I'm super happy to hear you say that. I find myself often in our community as when women have really low hormones or really low thyroid, and they have an aversion to doing anything prescriptive. Of course, I've been there myself. I wanted to do everything. I wanted to actually heal from the inside and not have to use anything prescriptive. But I found the same thing that you found when I started supporting my body with what it needed. Healing got easier. Like I could actually see in my labs where there's different protocols that I was trying without supporting my hormones properly, for example, that I couldn't seem to get traction with. And as soon as the hormone support was there, it seemed like I got huge traction with these different protocols because my body was actually supported. So I just want to kind of like shine a little spotlight on what you just said there, because there's no shame at all in getting support for your thyroid and your hormones if your labs are showing that they're low enough that they really need the support.
Yeah. And then what I would like to add to that also is that a lot of times people are told that once they get on medicine, they'll have to stay on forever. And I don't know if that's true for everyone. I'm not saying that, it's not true for every single person, but if your thyroid needs support and you support it when it's needed while fixing everything else, I've definitely had people that I've worked with that have been able to come off or lower their dose. So, some people say they don't want to go on because they don't want to be on forever. It doesn't have to be the case. It just depends on how much the thyroid is affected.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think, with some of the other things in terms of medications, we have the synthetics, which is Synthroid, and of course all the generics of that. And there's Tyrosine, which is like a little bit more natural form of that. And there's also compounding pharmacies that could do synthetics that are in a blend of vitamin C or probiotics. So there's no fillers at all, because we do have to be mindful about Synthroid having certain starches that people might be sensitive to. And then there's the synthetic T3s, like Cytomel, and of course the compounded ones of that, and then we have the combination ones like Armour and Westroid. And so those are more of the kind of natural desiccated thyroid type, and they come from an animal. And, you get the T4 and T3 together. And, it kind of depends on the person. Sometimes I find that people may have low T3 and completely normal T4. So in those cases, what my thought would be is, well, why give you T4 if your T4 is normal? Let's just do T3. And then we work with their doctor on that. And other times, it's the other way around. Usually though, if T4 is low, T3 is going to be a little bit lower. And in some cases, T4 is enough to then get your body to convert. If you're not converting well, we can work on natural things like zinc and selenium to help conversion, and also liver, because so much of the conversion happens in the liver. So we want to help conversion. But if it's not working, I do find that adding in the Cytomel can help. And then for other people, if they want to try the desiccated thyroid, then doing the Armour or the Nature Thyroid could be good. For me personally, I started on Nature Thyroid, but I noticed for myself, my antibodies shot through the roof. And it's not that common. It's something that you hear about and you read about as like, just isolated cases. But, of course, I was one of those isolated cases. I feel like I've had all these weird things that have happened, but I totally think that it's just because I needed to learn so I can help others. Yeah. And, and I actually felt really good on the Nature Thyroid. I felt amazing. My labs, except for my antibodies, were amazing. I mean, in perfect range. But I watched my antibodies go from 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 to 3,000. That's when I got to 6,000. And I said to myself, and I've talked to people and they said, you feel fine, your labs are good, don't worry. But I'm like, no, 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 like this doesn't
Yeah.
make sense, right? There's
Right.
inflammation here. And I have to tell you, and this is, I don't know if I would believe it if I didn't see it myself. I switched to the synthetic of Synthroid and Cytomel, but I got it compounded at a compounding pharmacy without any fillers. And, I kind of just matched the dose based on what I was getting in the Nature Throid. My antibodies dropped from 6,000 to 900 within a month, and then down below 400 a month after. It was that quick.
Wow. Yeah.
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 And again, I mean, not everyone is going to have this issue. So again, I don't want to scare people in any way, but just goes to show that we're all different. So if, your labs aren't looking the way they're supposed to, there's all of these other options to try.
Yeah. This is why I think it's so important that we do lab testing. It's really easy. And I know it can be one of those things. I mean, I've been on this journey long enough that I just know it's something that I have to work into the budget and figure out, how I'm going to pay for it. But it can be really easy just to, you get your initial test and then you start trying things and try to go based off your feelings. And it's just, I tried that in the beginning and I feel like I just wasted a lot of time that I couldn't get back, and I was spending money while I was wasting that time on things that weren't working well. So it's so important to test and make sure that, you really got your finger on what's working for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this is going to be awesome. I'm super excited for your event.
Thank you so much.
Tell everyone the dates, and we have a link here. If you're watching this on Facebook, we have a link in the status for you to go sign up for the Overcoming Hashimoto Summit. And if you're watching on YouTube, just look down in the description. But tell us a little bit more about it. Tell us the dates, and then give us a highlight of maybe some of your favorite talks.
Absolutely. So the summit launches on July 15th, and all the talks, actually, it's going to be 5 talks per day, and they go live on the 15th, and there'll be 5 talks per day from the 15th to the 21st. And then Encore weekend is the following weekend, which is the 28th and the 29th of July, where all 34 talks are opened up. And, the way I try to approach the summit is really, being that Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disease, like we talked about, I really kind of wanted people to get an understanding of all the different triggers. And like I said, not to scare anyone, but to really empower people to know that these are all the different triggers. And so, we look at everything, from GI stuff and the different toxins there, to infections, to emotions, to even limiting beliefs. People will be surprised, but I think very pleasantly, about some of the things that that could affect. And of course, all the different foods. We have Dr. Kasha Kynes on talking about Epstein-Barr. And what was very interesting about that is the medical medium, Anthony William, first kind of started to talk about it. And, I think people are like, oh, I don't know, this is kind of weird. But what she did is she kind of worked on bridging the gap between what he was saying and scientific literature, and really kind of authenticated some of the stuff he was saying, not everything, but a lot of it, there is truth to that. And she explains that in a very easy to understand way, but with a lot of science. We also talk about a concept that we use often in functional medicine called molecular mimicry, which is where certain infections can look similar to our organs. And so Dr. Darren Ingalls talks a lot about that. He has a great way of explaining it. Dr. Peter Osborne talks a lot about the genetics and the gluten and grain connection. We have Evan Brand on, who is talking about candida, but also mold. A lot of people don't realize that the two are connected. Another one that's really interesting is SIBO, because people don't often think about SIBO and Hashimoto's, but it's an infection. And so Dr. Osgood talks about that. And then another thing that I actually didn't realize was as big of a trigger as it was is H. pylori. We know H. pylori, which is a bacteria that lives in the stomach, can cause GERD. It causes a lot of digestive disturbances. But Lisa Pomeroy talks about that as being one of the biggest infectious triggers for Hashimoto's. And you guys have to watch that interview because she talks about a few other sort of infections and parasites that tend to go along with H. pylori. So if you have that, you want to look at some of these other things as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, this is going to be an excellent, excellent event. I hope everyone in our community can participate and get a great education, not only into Hashis, but autoimmunity in general. If you have thyroid issues, I think that you're going to find that there's a lot of great information that's going to support you in your journey as you make decisions on guiding your own health and wellness path, and also as you work with practitioners as it's needed. I say a lot in our community to lower your expectations of doctors, but that doesn't mean we don't need them. And certainly in my own journey, I couldn't do this without the support of a really good functional medicine practitioner who's helping me with especially the thyroid and hormone stuff. So you're going to get equipped with things that you can implement yourself, lifestyle stuff that's going to be important for you, but also some great insights that'll help you to know what kind of medical care, legitimate medical care you're going to need in order to get a handle on what you're seeing in your labs and experiencing with your symptoms. So thank
Yeah.
you so much, Inna.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And you guys go get signed up. All right. We'll see
Yeah.
y'all soon.